Hello, friends. This is your friend Kent C. Dodds, and I'm joined by my friend Vlad Magdalin. Say hi, Vlad.
Hey everyone. Hey Kent. Great to be here.
It's good to have you. I did ask you to say hi, Vlad, but that's okay. You can hi, everyone works too.
Yeah.
Vlad, I'm so excited to have you here. For those who don't know you, you founded a company called Webflow. I'd love for you to tell us a little bit more about that. But I met you. I think you'd already founded Webflow,
Yep.
and I think we met at React Rally. Is that right?
Yep. I don't remember exactly which one, but it was definitely a React Rally.
Yeah, I think you may have taken a bunch of us out to dinner or something, or lunch or
Yeah,
something
something
like
like that.
that.
Yep, that's right. I remember
You're
the place too. It was a sushi place, and it was
Yes.
amazing. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I remember that too, it's delicious. Yeah, fun times. I love React Rally, can't wait until we can meet in person, maybe this year, like, it might work out.
Hopefully,
So,
crossing fingers.
yeah, it's just been a pleasure to know and follow you, and a bunch of my friends have gone to work for you, and they all love it, at least that's what they tell me,
I like
and
to
they
think of it working with me. I kind of don't like the
yeah,
working for me phrase. It's a little bit old school, but
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
but I think I've tweeted this before, but, I have a short list of companies that I would like to work for, and Webflow is toward the top or maybe the top of that list.
Woo!
So yeah, like, just the interesting problems that you're tackling, and the amazing people that work with you. Merrick Christensen is one that comes to mind. I just love Merrick, and I was actually riding one wheel with him a few weeks ago, and he was telling me about the stuff that he's doing. He's like making a programming language or something.
Yeah.
It's like, what? So pretty interesting, fascinating stuff. But I need to stop talking. I want you to introduce yourself to our friends here, Vlad. Can you tell us about yourself? You can be as professional or personal as you want, and take as much time as you like.
Sure. Well, again, I'm so glad to be here. It's an honor to spend more time together. Like Ken said, my name is Vlad Magdalin. I grew up in Russia, actually. Came here as a refugee when I was 9, and started Webflow 4 different times. Starting in 2005, there's a couple or 3 failures up until the time that hopefully ends up not failing. So far, it's
Yeah.
working out. So started this iteration with my brother and another close friend from Intuit in 2012. And what we do is essentially we create a no code way for people to visually build for the web. And right now we're starting with websites where we try to abstract the same concepts behind HTML and CSS in JavaScript and elevate that into a much easier UI for designers, entrepreneurs, people who want to start a startup, for them to visually build a web experience. Um, and we're going deeper and deeper down the stack to where we now have a CMS, which is like an abstraction of a database, and we're also exploring logic and business logic, things like that. And Webflow is used by millions of people at this point, but
Wow.
we're still a really small fry compared to WordPress. WordPress is something like 50% of the internet. We're more like
Mm.
0.05 percent of all websites, but definitely having a lot of fun doing it. I don't know what I'm in charge of. I'm technically the CEO, but there's that job changes every 3 months or so. The company is about 250 people now, which is
Whoa.
rapidly scaling. So job feels different every day, but it's an honor to lead great people and work on this really important mission that we're on.
Wow, that's awesome. I'm just amazed after, like, just the tenacity to start the same kind of concept 4 times, and now, like, it seems to be working.
Yep.
What do you think is different about this time?
You could call it tenacity. Sometimes my wife calls it stubbornness or bullheadedness. Um, so many different factors made it work this time. Co-founders, right? My brother being an amazing designer, we built the product for him. He created essentially the entire user interface and like the abstraction visually. That I think that's the
Mm,
hard part. And then my co-founder Bryant, who was way better than me at backend stuff. I was more of a front end engineer. But the most important thing I think is the timing of web technology. The first 3 times when I try to start Webflow with different co-founders or by myself, like Chrome didn't exist, Firefox didn't exist. There wasn't like this set of APIs like the DOM API or CSSOM that really allowed you to build an app in the browser and to build something like Webflow for it to be truly WYSIWYG. you have to either write your own browser, which very few people can do, or you have to be able to emulate in real time what like a certain code change would have on the browser. And with
Mm,
Chrome 1.0, which kind of happened around 2010, 2011, was when something like what Webflow actually ended up being technologically was even possible. So
mm.
companies or other founders might have had the exact same idea. Uh, like call it Wix or Squarespace, they might have had the exact same idea, but just that technology wasn't available at the time.
Yeah, yeah.
So I think it really is a big combination of right people, lucky timing, and actually a little bit of lucky timing in the sense that when we started Webflow, everyone else was focused on mobile. Like there was almost no competition because every investor, every other company were like, oh, like the web is kind of dying, right? You have to focus on mobile apps, etc. So there wasn't much in terms of investment or encouragement, and people were like, this kind of idea failed before with Dreamweaver, and Adobe tried a bunch of times. Um, so it was like a really great combination of lots of factors that helped us, gave us the time and the runway to really figure out to build a technology.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that you're fighting for the web. I love the web. It is not dying, and
It is not at all.
yeah, yeah.
It is thriving.
That's great. And I'm glad that you have the stubbornness or tenacity to
Yeah,
keep going on this project. I think it's really cool. I bet most people who are listening in are have heard of Wix or Squarespace, and probably you're trying to frame Webflow into their mental model there.
yeah,
Can you kind of differentiate what is Webflow relative to those things?
yeah.
Are they direct competitors?
Not
You
at
also
all. So
mentioned,
if
yeah.
you think of Wix and Squarespace, they're sort of um, one of the best analogies I've been able to think of is like iMovie and After Effects or Final Cut Pro. Like iMovie, anybody can use to sort of cut together a pretty quick movie. And same thing with Wix and Squarespace. You kind of like pick a template and then change some content, but you're really within the constraints of that template. Whereas After Effects, like you're essentially creating production grade visual effects, and
Mm,
you really have to understand the core constraints of the medium to use that tool properly. Same thing with 3D animation software. Like to use that effectively, you have to understand modeling, animation, rigging, etc., down to like the core primitives. And Webflow is kind of the same. Webflow is almost like DevTools or Web Inspector plus some visual tools, right? So underneath it all, we truly abstract HTML elements and CSS declaration blocks, and within those, we just have visual abstractions over each CSS property. So it's essentially a one-to-one type of relationship where when you're using Webflow, you're essentially implementing the same way that you would write, maybe not CSS and JS, but like the traditional way of writing style sheets. You're kind of doing that in Webflow. In fact, we have like this code preview mode as you're making changes, like dragging the margin or changing the border, you can see the exact CSS property that's changing. Or as you're dragging in a new element, like a div, and then you choose whether it's a section or it's a an aside or something like that. It's the same sort of mental model of how you're thinking about hierarchy inside of a HTML template. Or something that's like an abstraction of HTML. So Webflow is very much way lower level in terms of asking our users and these professional designers to really understand core fundamentals of web development. They have to understand the box model. They have to understand how Flexbox primitives work. They have to understand that you don't just like click on something and move it to the right or just drag it to the right. You have to know to go to its parent or its container and set its properties to, let's say, align along a certain axis or whatever. So it's very much like sometimes we call it visual development. You're literally kind of thinking the same way that a developer would, not at the syntax level, but at the primitive level. So same way, when you start to work in Webflow with our content management system or our CMS, it's essentially like creating tables and columns in, a Postgres sort of definition or like an active record declaration if you're using Rails, where you have to think about, okay, which objects do I have? What is the relationship between them? You really have to think around like, is this like a one to many relationship? Is this a many to many relationship? And the constraints that entails, right? Because a lot of times, just because you have a link from one object to another doesn't mean you have like a link back from another object back. So you have to think of it
mm.
like as a developer would, as a data modeling exercise. So Webflow is like that way more professional tool set that's all about building really professional websites and applications. Um, so our entire mission is to how do we take most of the power of code and surface it in a way where you don't need to know most of the complexity or the accidental complexity behind having to write that code. Um,
Mm,
and that comes with some, some drawbacks, because it is a harder learning curve than Wix and Squarespace by like sometimes an order of magnitude. But
yeah.
once you learn those things, you essentially become you have the superpowers of a coder to a certain degree. Like we have people who, a single designer who is running an entire production marketing site that is like hundreds of pages or maybe even thousands of dynamic like data objects, where before it was a team of 4 engineers. And
Hmm.
those 4 engineers can now go work on something a lot more interesting than updating
Mm.
marketing sites.
Yeah.
And you're essentially getting all the benefits of running this stuff in production without a lot of the complexity behind it. Okay, how do we now QA this? How do we deploy it? How do we get this into production, et cetera, et cetera. Um, so yeah, a lot of times when I talk to developers, I really lean on the web inspector analogy, because the web inspector in Chrome, for example, is getting closer and closer to what Webflow is. Because a lot
Mm.
of times it's a lot easier to use a color picker than remember hex code, right?
Oh,
It's a lot
yeah.
easier to like define a gradient than remember like the syntax for a radial gradient, right? And that's
Hmm.
what Webflow is. It's just taking those visual abstractions and taking them to the next level, but not getting
Mm.
too far away from like the core foundations and the core principles of the web primitives that we're working on top of.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like, I mean, the ultimate would be computer build me this website that does this thing, and the computer just does it all, right? Like,
Yeah, I don't
so
believe that's
so
possible, actually.
yeah, you don't think it's possible? I'd love to hear you talk about
I
like because it sounds like you're making some trade-offs on like what we think would be perfect, right? Like it
Yeah,
would just be so nice if we could just make it do this, but it's because it's not. We need to make trade-offs and move a little bit
yeah.
further down the abstraction layers. And you feel like you've hit the spot with where Webflow is at. Why do you feel that is the right layer of abstraction for
Take
people?
because I believe that human creativity and expectations are always rising. So think of it like the 3D animation or let's say 3D movie production equivalent, right? There, we've created really, really impressive, like super sophisticated tools that hide a lot of complexity. Before, you
Mm,
needed developers to figure out, like each company was sort of building their own version of a render, like an animation system, or you really had to be kind of a developer that understood WebGL or other like 3D rendering principles in order to like tell a
mm,
story and work at Pixar. Now we have like really sophisticated software, like modeling, rigging, animation, particle effects, like really, really sophisticated things. However, the hard part of like what story do you tell? How do you make the characters? How do you make them unique? How do you make them tell a really lively story? All that stuff is still coming from like human ingenuity and like
mm,
you're never going to get to a place where you say, hey, some Pixar brain, create a engaging human story that's going to sell well, right? I
mm,
think that's always going to have need that, like that humanity in the context of like the creatives to figure out what problem are we solving or what story are we telling, and then use like the tools to augment that creative endeavor, right? And I think that when you're building for the web, it's always going to be that way, whether it's websites or as we go deeper into applications. The hard part is always like discovering a problem in the world, like, hey, this is inefficient, like let's say booking a ticket for a concert is like super tedious and I don't like using Ticketmaster. I have an idea for how this can be much better, right? And I want to
mm,
use software to solve that. The hard part is understanding users. What is their problem? What is the flow of things? And like constantly iterating and tweaking that and learning. I don't know if we like if you go into a full like AI world where there's general AI, maybe then we have much bigger problems than who's building
yeah.
software.
Yeah.
uh, then pretty sure we'll be worried much more about our survival than like should designers code
Yeah.
or not. Um, so I do think that Webflow and other tools are going to rise to that level of abstraction where like the tools try to hide as much of the complexity as is reasonable, that you don't want to repeat over and over, right? Like not everybody should be rebuilding their authentication system or their own deployment system, or
Right.
for the same way that not everybody, not all developers today are like rolling their own hardware. They're just like getting computing power from a cloud provider, right?
Yeah. It's
So
getting
it's
commoditized, like more
exactly.
higher up the stack, we just keep on getting more
Yeah, so
commoditized.
I think the problems at the very top of the stack of like what is the product, what is the user experience, those are always going to be really hard and are going to require like teams of people to keep iterating and understanding their customer base and trying to find product market fit, et cetera, because they're so imperfect. But the lower down the stack you go, the more we're going to find abstractions. We already have all these abstractions through APIs, right? Like you and I, as developers, probably 15 years ago, had to roll our own like authorized.net thing. Now we just use Stripe. Uh,
Right.
Somebody 5 years ago would have had to use Stripe directly. Now they can just use Stripe elements, where that's even further abstracted. Like 2 years ago, you could just use Webflow, which uses Stripe elements, and you're just like dragging and dropping things underneath the hood. You're essentially like replacing the same or using the same exact code that you would use as a developer. But we're hiding more and more of that complexity to like really make sure people are focusing on the things that truly matter, the things that are truly unique, right? The things that you don't know how they should work.
Mm,
Um, so I think that's always going to be the case where we want to make sure the tools mature to the point where a lot of the same problems that software engineers are solving all over the world, we try to find ways that only a few software engineers need to solve them, and then people can like an order of magnitude more people, if not two, can use those primitives to build like higher order things. So one example is
right.
let's say like the Stripe example. You could either teach every single person like, hey, now there's like the Stripe elements thing, here's how you pull in some API code to like pull it into your like HTML or React template or whatever. Or you could say now this primitive of taking a payment is this no code thing, that like this visual thing that you just drag out and say, I'm going to have a payment flow here, and then you specify sort of some of its parameters, the same thing that you would pass in like the API call you would send to Stripe. And now what you've done is you've essentially removed the requirement that people have to know, like understand the context of like, okay, here's an example of a code snippet. Where do I even put that in? Like most developers will know, but most people won't know. And most people in the world are not developers by a long shot, right? 99.5% of the world is not like doesn't know anything about code, let alone like is a software engineering professional. So it's really the entire no code movement is about removing barriers, and giving more and more people access to that power. The exact same thing happened with things like spreadsheets 40 years ago, right? It was like this there was a moment where the industry, the software development industry, they were writing like Fortran and COBOL and Pascal, and almost everything was being done through these like terminal based software applications, from like really basic things like making sure the books are closed, and making sure that our financial models are accurate. And then when spreadsheets came around, first they were kind of like toys, right? And eventually they got more and more serious, where people could solve like real financial modeling use cases with it. And the assumption was like, oh shoot, this is gonna like steal jobs from software developers because this is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
The reality was that you now have enabled 1,000 times as many people to solve problems with computing, which means that 1,000 times as many shots on goal to like validate a business idea now happen. Maybe 10% of them, worked out, and now 10% of those need more developers to go like work on the more complex stuff. And
Yeah.
and we've had an entire software development industry kind of blossom out of that. So the same thing is happening now with no code, right? Where you have 100 times as many people trying to build stuff with software. Eventually, they will need more custom things. And when they need more custom things, they build a company around it. Then they have to hire software engineers and et cetera. It only creates more demand. And now we're seeing actually even more demand for software engineers than we did 5 years ago.
Mm,
Like non-linearly so, because more people are starting to solve problems with software. And eventually it kind of gets to these like, hey, we need more firepower here, we need more people to go in and solve problems that these visual tools don't solve yet. But now, because 100 times as many people are doing these things, there's just fundamentally more demand. So it's almost like one of those rising tide lifts all boats types of things. And it's not a zero
yeah.
sum thing where for every no code designer creating something, like a software engineer is somehow like losing a job, um, which is wonderful because it makes you feel really good about the mission. When we first started, it was like a lot of that like worry around like, hey, are we going to be taking jobs away from people, et cetera. And I'm glad that's not the case.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes total sense to me what you've described. So you've decided to operate at an abstraction level currently, where people have to understand the box model,
Yep.
or like at least from an abstract standpoint, not necessarily the syntax
Right.
around CSS and layout necessarily. Do you foresee Webflow ever being able to move outside of those foundational understandings for people? Like if Webflow could have an abstraction on top of that, so people don't have to worry
Yes.
about that as
We
much.
already have that abstraction. So we have like the core Webflow designer, which is like the really, really pro tool. And then we have the editor, which is a lot more like Squarespace or Wix. That's meant so it's depending on the persona, right? So it would be like what we call a visual developer or a professional designer creating like all the fundamental bits and pieces. They have to understand the box model. They have to understand data modeling. They have to understand how these JavaScript based animations work and like the limitations of that. They have to understand things like, hey, when I animate transform a transform around like translate X or Y or whatever, it's a lot more efficient than like animating XY position, right? They need to understand those things. But then once they build the actual application, they hand it off to somebody that's managing content or somebody that's adding pages, somebody that's just using existing components that somebody put into like a style guide or whatever. Then the level of abstraction is much higher, right? They now think of it on an even higher order plane of like, okay, now I have, it's a lot more like Squarespace where I have like these pre-built components that this designer created. But the very important thing is if you only do that, then it's hard to like, in order to go to that more complex power piece, you have to break out into code. So that's why it was important for us to build this first and then start to make that power available to more people. And now what we're seeing is that it's not just like a designer that's enabling like a less technical person to operate in this like editor, like more simplified editor abstraction. But what you're seeing is designers who like go really deep on the software in Webflow really understand it. They're creating components that they're putting out into the ecosystem. Like they're creating like these galleries of like components that they spend a week on building, and then somebody else, without knowing all the like complexity of how those things are built, they'll just copy paste into their project and it's essentially done. So they're almost like the same way that we would pull from like npm, and it's sort of like we get the benefit of other developers working on something. It's kind of the same principle where now designers who are less technical are using the work of designers who are much more technical, and they're kind of like reusing that work without really having to understand exactly how it was implemented from the ground up.
Wow, that's very cool. I like that. And the way that you describe it makes it sound like the lower level editor is where you build your own Squarespace or you build your own Wix, and then you take that, and on top of that, you can
It's
use
a
your
it's a little
own.
bit like so it's not like building your own Squarespace or Wix. It's like building your own Squarespace or Wix template. So what happens in
Yeah,
Squarespace and Wix? It's their team, their software engineers that are building each template, right? So what we're saying is like now Webflow users, these professional designers, can build the templates,
yeah, yeah,
and what we're only building is like the template builder. So we're basically
yeah.
building the level editor, and then people can build their own games or their own levels,
Mm,
etc. And then they
yeah,
can share those levels with other people and have like other people play in those kind of environments. And the cool thing
yeah.
is like once you've done it, you can actually like make it available to the world. So now we have like this huge template marketplace where um, other Webflow users are making a living just selling their templates to people who
That's
don't
awesome.
don't want to go deeper on like building those things from scratch, but they can benefit a ton from sort of again like standing on the shoulders of giants.
I love
So you
that.
kind
That's
of
very
get the
cool.
benefit of both worlds.
Yeah, very cool. And so it's really interesting the approach that you're taking, and I think that what I really like about this is what you said about how this isn't a zero sum game. This is actually like a rising tide lifting all
Yep.
boats, where you're kind of democratizing creation, or
Hmm.
like, yeah, content creation
Yep.
on the web. And what's really cool about that is we don't know what like how many people have died in a third world country who could have been the next Mozart, or
Right.
whatever, just because they didn't have the opportunity. And so what you're offering to people is the opportunity to create on the web that they wouldn't have the opportunity to do otherwise. And I
Absolutely.
just think that's awesome.
Like the best equivalent I've seen is the movie industry, and how we've democratized creation around video through so many
Mm,
different platforms. Right, there's now people making a living on like YouTube and Twitch and all these other platforms that doesn't steal from the fact that there's blockbuster movies being built by
Yeah.
Hollywood, right? And that actually didn't steal a ton of demand from people going to see traditional movies, and it lifted the entire industry because now more people need like video equipment, more people need like more professional or prosumer video equipment, more people are seeking training around video editing, more people as they sort of elevate from, hey, now I'm just a hobbyist trying to figure out how to do YouTube. Okay, now I have a following, now I need like a more professional setup, etc. It lifted the entire industry. It didn't have to like steal from somewhere else in order to enable many more people to benefit from being able to share their voice or their ideas or tell these stories or these sketch comedy shows or whatever. There's so much, like, who would have ever imagined if you had like the movie industry in charge of all video production, that there would be like millionaire children on like uh, unboxing videos, and that there
Yeah.
would be demand for that, or like ASMR or whatever. Like, you just go down the list. By making access to that medium a lot more accessible, you're just opening up the world to be able to express a lot more ideas. And with software, it's even more powerful because you're not just creating an entertainment experience or like a just in time type of like, hey, you watch this video and this is the experience. You can actually have like multiplicative effects because you can create a product or a service that solves the same problem. That's the power of software. You solve it once, and as long as people find out about it, you now have like this flywheel where more people can just use that software to solve that same problem for themselves, and the creator can make a living, form a company around it, do a lot of great things in the world because now they've made somebody's life easier, and were able to sustain and finance a team, et cetera, et cetera. And that is just a really, really powerful concept. It's the same way. It just feels wrong to a degree to have that level of power locked up in just the hands of 0.25% of the world. And when the reality
Mhm.
is that the demand for this kind of work is so grand once people figure out that they can solve so many problems with software. So especially in an environment where it's not zero sum, like every person learning how to use no code tools doesn't actually take anything away from a developer, unless honestly you're like a really terrible developer, right? Like if you were a developer 10 years ago and your only job was taking Photoshop templates and turning them into HTML, and that's the only skill you had, which does not describe very many developers, then sure, maybe that was kind of like a threatening thing where a lot of these services that came around that just like automated that,
Mm.
or made it much cheaper or commoditized it, then yes, if you don't upskill or like learn React or something like that, then yeah, you might be in trouble. But for the vast majority of developers who are going much deeper on the software stack, it's not a problem at all. It only
Mhm.
creates a lot more demand for the skill that they learned.
Yeah, and even if that is you, and that's fine if it is, but you might want to see the writing on the wall. And if you don't want to upskill, that's fine. You just go build a bunch of templates on Webflow, and it sounds like you
Exactly.
can make
We
a
have
living
actually we have a ton of developers using Webflow because it's just like just straight up faster, right? For the same reason that you would use dev tools a lot of times, where you just don't want to remember the syntax.
there.
So it's
Hmm.
the right tool for the job. Sometimes, sometimes it's not, right? Sometimes code is absolutely the right tool for the job. Uh,
Yeah, I'm actually curious about that intersection. So let's say I work at a company and I feel like Webflow is going to be good for me for the company, but I
yep,
realize, wait, like that's kind of what my job is. So what is my job now as a developer at this company where we're starting to adopt Webflow? How
yep,
do I integrate with that? Like I've got services that we're using. How do I integrate those?
yep.
I know we have like a minute left, but we can go
Yeah.
over a little bit
I
if
mean,
you
there's a
want.
bunch of flexibility. Like Webflow is no code, but there's a lot of ways to extend it with code. So developers typically can add code to like integrate it to other services, etc. Most of the things that Webflow is used in today, like marketing sites, like developers, that's their second choice to work on, if not third or fourth or
Yeah.
fifth. Like they want to move to product, they want to move to like algorithms, etc. So in most cases, the developers are the ones that are selling it internally. They're like, hey, if I can teach the marketing team and the design team to go do this stuff without having to, wait on me to go do that translation of like a Figma file to some HTML template, all the power to the design team, right? And it makes the developer's life easier. But there's so many different ways. Webflow is not an isolated thing. It's just like when you follow the right abstractions, um, whatever Webflow doesn't do, you can quickly augment with code. So that's why I mentioned like there's always demand for more developers because you inevitably run into cases that are not abstracted yet. or won't be
Mm.
for a long time.
So I as a company that's using Webflow, I could build little like components in Webflow that integrate with our country selector that has some weird filters on it or whatever, and like hit my APIs for different things.
You can usually people use it in a lot more of a like, for example, the entire marketing site is built in Webflow, right? And then you might have content in Webflow that you pull into other places, but only if the main source of truth for your content is in Webflow.
Mm.
You don't yet, like, not a lot of people use it in like very partial ways. Like, I'll have some components in Webflow, then I have another code base, and you try to like pull things across. That's still a little too manual. So it's more what we see is like one department will start to use Webflow where it's like really appropriate for like marketing sites or like internal sites or like larger content sites or dynamic ones. But then build other, like, their main application in, a more traditional code based way. You usually don't get too much of a mix. But where we're headed in
Yeah.
the future is that more and more, like, this area where designers live and the source of truth for like what they own is going to start to expand, right? Over time, designers are going to be hopefully in control of the design system, right? Where developers can pull that in as like almost like an NPM import.
Hmm.
And like, all the different responsive variants and breakpoints are defined by a designer. And then when they change the design system, it just changes everywhere. Like, hopefully we'll head in that direction, but it's going to be gradual. It's not going to be like an all or nothing thing. So you're going to see more and more use cases being kind of in designer land without this big intermediate handoff piece where, like, this is what I meant, I can't implement this, or this is going to take 2 weeks, or this is not how we do things here, or whatever. Hopefully it moves more and more towards kind of what we see with SVGs, right? Like, you have the
Mm.
designer in control of those assets, and then they sort of hand over the final asset to a developer. You don't typically have a developer like rewriting an SVG.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
so something like that is going to start happening more with like design systems, simple design systems, then more complex ones as these tools develop, etc.
Yeah. Okay. Very cool. I feel like there are 100 more questions that I'd love to ask you about Webflow,
We'll
but
do
we're
round two later.
yeah, yeah. We're out of time for this show. Do you was there anything else that you wanted to make sure we talked about before we wrap up?
I think we covered everything. I feel like if I mention something else, we can go on another 20-minute
Yeah, maybe we should do
conversation.
another episode.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I do want to close the loop on the idea that like Webflow and technologies and the no code movement in general is broadening the number of people who are able to create on the web. And this is a very good thing. And so our homework lines up with that. And the homework is for you, listener, I'm talking to you, teach a non coder one coding related topic without using syntax, without using code. And anything to add to that, Vlad?
Yeah, one the way I think about that homework problem is almost everything in Webflow, for example, is a pure abstraction over something that you would write syntax around. So, like the box model, right? You can explain it by writing HTML, but you can also explain it by going to DevTools and like clicking on boxes and changing some settings on the side and helping a non-technical person see sort of like how those things connect. And same thing with like data modeling or trying to explain object-oriented programming. Um, and I think the critical piece with that homework is that once you get a person to see that they have this hammer that they can now start to potentially solve their own problems with, and they don't think of software development as like this, oh, I have a cousin who builds apps, and it's like this magical abstraction that somehow requires a 4-year degree. Once they start to see things, software development, the way they see spreadsheets, right? They think of a problem like, oh, I can track this list of attendees for a party using spreadsheets or Airtable or whatever. Once we explain more of these high level principles behind software engineering, it demystifies the practice, and people feel more and more confident to start to explore software creation as like a skill that they can practice themselves. Which I've always seen as, once people have that aha moment, it's like discovering reading in a sense, because you're like, okay, now not only do I have access to understand what this word is, but I have access to so much more knowledge. Um, and hopefully more and more developers can have these kinds of conversations with folks and help them understand the power of software.
Yeah, great. I'm looking forward to showing my wife the box model. That'll be great.
Awesome. And
Um,
if it doesn't work, we have a whole video on Webflow University
oh,
that
yeah, perfect.
connects it. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, great. So one other thing on that, I had another episode. I don't know whether it's going to be scheduled before after this one, but if you haven't already listened to it yet, go listen to that one. It's with Maggie Appleton, and she talks a lot about metaphors. She's the one who does all of the like egghead, beautiful design
Mhm.
illustration stuff. She's the one behind that. And so she comes up with these metaphors to explain software concepts. It's a really great episode. So listen to that one, do that homework, and then maybe do this one. So,
Awesome.
okay. Thanks, everybody, for listening in. Vlad, last thing, what's the best way for people to keep up with what you're doing?
I'm on and off Twitter. Sometimes I'm active, sometimes it's not very active. I'm just at Call Me Vlad there. That's probably the best way. And yeah, hope to see many of you online.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We'll see you all later.
Bye.